By late 1780, the American Revolutionary War in the North had ground to a bloody stalemate, prompting British strategists to pivot south. They believed the vast reservoir of loyal support awaited them, ready to rally to the crown and extinguish the rebellion. Initial successes fed this conviction. The captures of Savannah and Charleston, followed by the catastrophic American defeat at Camden. It created a powerful yet ultimately false sense of British control. Beneath this veneer of victory, the Carolina backcountry was a smoldering tinderbox. The conflict developed into a brutal civil war, a landscape of vicious raids and reprisals that pitted neighbor against neighbor. The Patriot cause seemed desperate. Into this volatile theater stepped a cast of commanders who would shape the war's final act. For the Americans, there was the newly appointed and remarkably capable Major General Nathanael Greene, tasked with rebuilding a shattered army. He would rely on men like Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, a rugged frontiersman and a brilliant battlefield commander. He was known as Old Wagoner. Their primary adversary was the formidable Lord Charles Cornwallis, the overall British commander in the South. At his disposal was Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, a young, reckless, and feared cavalryman whose elite British Legion gave no quarter, a ruthlessness that patriots grimly termed Tarleton's Quarter. A bold strategic gamble by Greene would soon set these forces on a collision course. Faced with Cornwallis's superior army, Nathanael Greene made an unorthodox and audacious decision. He divided his own weaker force. This asymmetrical maneuver defied conventional military wisdom, but it was a calculated risk designed to spirit up the people, harass British outposts, and disrupt supply lines, and critically, force Cornwallis to split his own army in response. By creating multiple threats, Greene leveraged mobility against mass, transforming his weakness into a strategic advantage. He dispatched a detachment under Daniel Morgan to operate in the backcountry, threatening the British flank and rallying the Patriot militia. Cornwallis reacted just as Greene had hoped. He detached his most aggressive commander, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, and his elite British Legion to hunt down and destroy Morgan's force. What followed was a relentless pursuit across rain-swollen landscape of the Carolinas. Tarleton, whose youth and easy victories had bred an impetuous overconfidence, was legendary for his speed. In a previous chase, his legion had covered an astonishing 105 miles in just 54 hours. He drove his men to the point of utter exhaustion, forcing them to march since 2 o'clock in the morning on the final day. By the time they closed in on Morgan, Tarleton's troops were cold, underfed, and bone weary. As Morgan later wrote, Tarleton came on like a thunderstorm, a testament to the speed and ferocity of the pursuit. Knowing he could not outrun his tenacious pursuer indefinitely, Morgan was forced to turn and choose a piece of ground on which to stand and fight. Daniel Morgan's choice of battlefield seemed, to his officers, a catastrophic error. It was, in fact, a work of psychological genius, a deliberate trap tailored to the predictable aggression of his opponent and the known limitations of his own troops. He chose a well-known pasturing area called the Cowpens, a clearing described as open woods, thickly covered with red oak and hickory, and little, if any, underbrush. The terrain offered no swamps or natural obstacles to protect his flanks from Tarleton's feared cavalry. Most alarmingly, Morgan positioned his army with the flood-swollen broad river at his back, cutting off any possible retreat. This was not a blunder, but a calculated message. Old Wagoner understood the frontier psyche. He knew his militia, who had had a history of fleeing in the face of British bayonets, needed to be stripped of any option for disorganized retreat. At Cowpens, there would be nowhere to run. On the night of January 16, 1781, Morgan walked among the campfires, exuding confidence and explaining his plan to every man. He spoke to the militia in their own language, stroking a competition between the Georgia and Carolina units. and promising them that if they stood firm, they would give Tarleton a devil of a whooping. As dawn approached on January 17, his scouts raced into camp with the news he was waiting for. Tarleton was coming. They gave us the British halloo, boys. Give them the Indian halloo. At Cowpens, Daniel Morgan conducted a tactical masterpiece, a near-perfect symphony of deception, discipline, and timing. His plan did not merely account for the American militia's perceived weakness, their propensity to break under pressure, but ingeniously used it as a very mechanism of the British undoing. While defense in depth was not a new concept, Morgan's genius lay in reversing the strength of his interlinear formations, creating progressively stronger lines to absorb the shock of the British assault. The first line was the harassers. They were positioned 150 yards ahead of the main body, 150 sharpshooters. Their orders were simple and deadly: harass the advancing British at long range, specifically targeting the officers. Aim for the epaulets before making an orderly withdrawal. Their purpose was to inflict early casualties and disrupt the enemy's cohesion. The second line, they were the bait. Here stood 300 militia under the command of Colonel Andrew Pickens. Morgan gave them a revolutionary order that acknowledged their limitations. He did not ask them to stand and die like regulars. He only asked them to fire 2 well-aimed shots into the charging army and then make a disciplined retreat around the American left to regroup behind the cavalry. Their withdrawal was designed to lure the overconfident British into a reckless charge. The third line, they were the Anvil. The American line consisted of battle-hardened Continental Army veterans under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Edgar Howard. They were positioned on a slight rise. They were the anvil upon which the British charge would be broken. Held in reserve and concealed from view behind a low ridge was Lieutenant Colonel William Washington's cavalry, ready to deliver the decisive blow. Just before sunrise, Tarleton arrived. Impetuous and predictable, he ordered an immediate frontal assault, throwing his exhausted troops into the attack without rest or even proper reconnaissance. The battle unfolded exactly as Morgan envisioned. The American sharpshooters disrupted the British advance, picking off several dragoon officers before falling back to the militia line. Pickens' men stood their ground, unleashing 2 punishing volleys into the British ranks. Then, as instructed, they began their orderly retreat. Seeing the militia pulling back, the British soldiers did what they had always done. Believing the Americans were breaking the full rout, they let out a cheer, broke their own disciplined ranks, and charged headline toward the Continental line, smelling victory. The critical moment of the battle came not from planned fate, but from a fortunate accident masterfully exploited. As the British surged forward, Howard ordered his rightmost company to wheel back to protect the American flank. The order was misunderstood in the roar of battle, and the entire Continental line began orderly, disciplined withdrawal. This movement further convinced the charging British that victory was in their grasp. Morgan rode to Howard, who confirmed the line was not broken. Seizing the opportunity, Morgan ordered his Continentals to halt, turn, and fire. The result was catastrophic. From a distance of less than 30 yards, the Continentals unleashed an unexpected and deadly fire, a single devastating volley that ripped through the disorganized and breathless British ranks. The fortunate volley was a signal for the trap to spring shut. Following the fusillade, Howard ordered the charge for Bayonet. His Continental surged forward, smashing into the shocked and reeling British line. At that exact moment, William Washington's cavalry thundered from behind a ridge, crashed into one British flank. Simultaneously, the regrouped militia, having circled around the American rear, charged into the other flank. This perfectly timed 3-pronged attack constituted a classic double envelopment, a mini-cannonade that was unique in the American Revolution. The British force, caught in a vice and attacked from 3 sides, disintegrated completely. In the chaotic aftermath, William Washington engaged in a brief, dramatic sword duel with Banastre Tarleton himself. The British commander barely escaped, fleeing the field with a mere handful of his men. The news of the disaster at Cowpens struck Lord Cornwallis with the force of a physical blow. Upon hearing Tarleton's report, his temper snapped. He broke his sword over his knee. It almost broke my heart, he later admitted. The totality of the American victory was reflected in the staggering casualty figures. The British had suffered over 100 killed, 229 wounded, and nearly 600 taken prisoner. In contrast, the American casualties were a mere 24 killed and 104 wounded. That is not just a numerical defeat. It was a virtual annihilation of the swift, hard-hitting light infantry that formed the core of Cornwallis's mobile army. Enraged and desperate to retrieve his captured soldiers, Cornwallis made a fateful and reckless decision. In an act of desperation that marked a point of no return, he ordered his army to burn its excess baggage and supplies, stripping his force for a high-speed pursuit of Morgan's army. The initiated campaign, known as the Race to the Dan, Morgan quickly linked up with General Greene, who then masterfully led the pursuing British on a grueling 200-mile chase across North Carolina, executing a strategy of attrition that drew Cornwallis ever farther from his coastal supply bases. To buy the crucial final hours, Greene's rear guard under Colonel Otho Holland Williams brilliantly feinted towards the wrong ferry crossing, deceiving Cornwallis. The campaign accumulated as Greene's army crossed the Dan River into the safety of Virginia, just hours ahead of the British vanguard, a maneuver made possible only by Greene's foresight in having collected boats weeks earlier. The chase led directly to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781. There, Cornwallis won the field, but it was at a ruinous cost, losing nearly a quarter of his remaining army. The Pyrrhic victory left his force too crippled to continue the campaign in the Carolinas. Broken and exhausted, Cornwallis retreated to Wilmington and then made his final fatal march in Virginia. This move culminated in his encirclement and surrender at Yorktown. As future Chief Justice John Marshall later assessed, the victory at Cowpens initiated an unbroken chain of consequences that led directly to the end of the war. The Battle of Cowpens stands not only as a pivotal turning point in the American Revolution, but as one of the most brilliant tactical victories of the war. In less than an hour, Daniel Morgan had achieved what many thought impossible. His innovative tactics proved that American militia, when led with an understanding of their strengths and weaknesses, could be a decisive instrument in the defeat of the British regulars. The battle's legacy endures as a case study in leadership, deception, and masterful use of combined arms. Its tactics are still studied at military academies like West Point, a testimony to the old Wagoner's genius. The site itself is preserved as Cowpens National Battlefield, where ongoing restoration efforts strive to maintain the landscape's 1781 appearance, allowing visitors to stand on the ground where a backwoods pasture turned the tide of revolution.